This is section 4, and we're going to be talking about the creation of a uniquely American empire and the ways in which this actually transpires. Imperialism is a little bit of a loaded word, and I do want to warn you in advance that you're definitely going to see some unsettling images later in this presentation. This use of the term imperialism is not meant to be an indictment of the United States, especially the United States military. I am just making some basic observations about history. I'm not trying to make a statement or pass a moral judgment upon the things that happened in the past. And last time I gave this lecture, several students took it upon themselves to start a protest movement against Dole fruit. And while as entertaining as that was, it missed the point a little bit about what we're trying to understand when we think about American imperialism. In terms of the United States, it really starts right here with this man, Alfred Thayer Mahan. He's born in 1840, he dies in 1914, and he was a line officer in the Civil War, meaning he served in the Navy during the Civil War. And he writes this book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And this book explains the rise of great states in terms of their relationship to sea power. And he makes the observation that every significant power for the last 100 years, Great Britain, etc., has had an extremely powerful navy. And this book, this idea of thinking, is very influential, especially to the United States Navy. I mean, obviously, the Navy always wants to have larger and bigger ships. But in response to this idea that a nation has to have a powerful navy to be an advanced civilization, to have influence abroad, the United States embarks on a massive naval capital ship campaign, both funding and building great big battleships. Prior to the actual beginning of construction of new battleships, most of the ships in the United States Navy were what was called mixed caliber guns. And you can see this on the top left-hand photo there. You've got multiple gun turrets, but they're of different sizes. And a really good example of this is the USS Georgia. So these are still powerful warships. They've got great big cannons. They've got fairly good range, but they're dated by the time period we're talking about. They're not the most powerful ship afloat by this time. And those earlier ships are replaced by a whole new class of battleship, colloquially known as dreadnoughts. And you can see the USS Texas here is an example of this. Look at the guns on the deck. They're all the same caliber. Generally, these guns are in the 8 to 10 inch bore range. There's case-mated guns on the sides. And these vessels are heavily armored below the waterline, and they're powered by monstrous steam turbine. They burn a lot of fuel to keep in motion. So you can see in this photograph here, and this is an older photograph that has been hand-colored, but the steam turbines are generating all that thick black smoke. And what the United States does is it paints all of its vessels white. It's called the Great White Fleet, and it sends these vessels around the world on a world tour. And this is a clear expression of power by showing off these new naval vessels. And the range of these ships is only limited by fuel. And if you're going to have ships crossing back and forth across large oceans like, say, the Pacific, you're going to have places that you can maintain a coaling station. So the United States begins to eyeball places like Hawaii, little way stations where they can establish naval bases so that their ships have some place to refuel on their way to whatever their destination happens to be. Now, the story of Hawaii and how it comes to be part of the United States is an excellent example of U.S. imperialism, but it is not an example of just outright military conquest where the United States would have attacked something. It's more of a long-term economic, socio-political takeover. And there's a little bit of background about Hawaii that you have to know to fully understand the story. In 1810, the first major king in Hawaii unifies all of the smaller islands, and his name was Kamehameha I. And he does this through military conquest, and he establishes a dynasty of rulers that lasts up into the 1870s. But before we get to the 1870s, somewhere in the 1820s, missionaries begin to arrive in Hawaii from the mainland. And they upset the whole social structure of the island, and they begin to cause people to question the power of the king. And one of the ways that Kamehameha had set up his power and unified the islands was through a series of kapus, and kapus are basically taboos. Think of them like laws, okay? And some of these laws were in conflict with the teachings from the missionaries, and this begins to put these doubts in Hawaiians' mind as to where is the real power and who do you follow. And you can pretty much guess the kind of reaction that the missionaries had when they encountered these societies with very liberal attitudes toward dress code and sexual relations between unmarried partners and things like that. And so the very first thing the missionaries do is they begin to set up schools to teach things like English and proper dress. And the record demonstrates that the missionaries were completely scandalized by the Hawaiians' attitude toward fraternization between male and female, and there was a long-standing practice in the islands of incest among the ruling elites, and the missionaries had, obviously they had tremendous trouble with this. Missionaries also wrote that they had trouble with the visiting crews of whale ships. They would come onto the islands and chase women and get drunk and carry on, creating even more trouble. But once these missionaries have established themselves, there's nothing really the Hawaiians can do to preserve their culture. There's not really any way they can root them out or get rid of them. And so you have this time period in Hawaii where there's these questions about power and who has the ultimate authority and who should be speaking the loudest. And at this time period, you run into a series of crises in the royal family, and specifically failures of the leaders to produce heirs. And in this chaos of secession, and we don't need to go into the line of kings of Hawaii, but there's a man called David Kalakaua who comes to the throne, and this is 1874. And for the following decade or so, King David is plagued by scandal after scandal after scandal. He's publicly involved in a huge enterprise to import opium and charging Chinese to work on the sugar plantations in Hawaii. There's multiple boondoggles with vanity currency, printing special money with his picture on it, huge building programs with really no plan of how to pay for them. And in response to all of these scandals, the descendants of the original missionaries from the 18 teens organized themselves into a loose group called the Hawaiian League. And the Hawaiian League favors annexation to the United States over this mismanagement and continued chaos created by the Hawaiian monarchy. And in 1887, the Hawaiian League, under the direction of a man named Sanford B. Dole, along with a man named Lauren A. Thurston, lead a small group of armed planters, kind of the white elite agricultural aristocracy of Hawaii, against the king. And they force the king to sign a new constitution. And they literally do this at gunpoint. So the constitution becomes known as the Bayonet Constitution. And what this document does is it strips most of the power away from the monarchy, and it places it in the hands of a legislature and a cabinet that is composed almost entirely of land-owning whites. These are the descendants of men that were in that original group of missionaries that came to the Hawaiian Islands. Now, this Constitution also reduced voting rights to men only, and it took away rights of native and naturalized Hawaiians, and also American citizens who could not meet very strict land owning and tax requirements. So there's been a shakeup of power after the Bayonet Constitution, and in the wake of this, King David dies, and his relative, queen, becomes queen, and her name is Liliuokalani. And as an aside, you should probably recognize the name of Dole. I challenge you to go into the grocery store and look around at the bananas and pineapples and try and find some that are not produced by this company. So we're not talking about an insubstantial amount of agriculture, even at this time period. We're talking about extremely rich, extremely large amounts of area, physical geography under cultivation, and this puts a lot of money and power in the hands of these descendants of the original missionaries. The Queen is a true Hawaiian patriot and an absolute nationalist, and hates the idea of the Bayonet Constitution and wants to restore power to the monarchy, wants to expand native voting rights back to the way they were, wants to begin to put power back in the hands of Hawaiians. And this is, of course, very problematic for these men that have gathered all of this power to themselves. So Lauren A. Thurston organizes what's called the Committee of Safety. And ostensibly, this Committee of Safety is designed to defend the property rights of these rich landholders under the Bayonet Constitution. And they activate what's called the Honolulu Rifles. And this is a volunteer militia of about 1,500 non-native, meaning white citizens, and they surround the Queen's Palace. The Queen's Palace is called the Lolani Palace. And here's a photograph of the Honolulu, some of the officers of the Honolulu Rifles in their full dress uniforms. And even though we're talking about some fairly bald attempts to overthrow government and remove the monarchy, the United States is still not really involved quite yet. There is an American ambassador in Hawaii at this time. His name is John L. Stevens, and Stevens sees what is going on, and he calls on a naval vessel offshore to send in its contingent of Marines to, quote, protect American interest and American life in the event of a coup. This does not mean that the United States attacks Hawaii, invades in any kind of traditional military sense. They don't go to the palace and put handcuffs on the Queen or anything like that. He's just calling for Marines to be delivered ashore and then to be available if there is in fact a coup. This is the vessel that Stevens contacts. This is the armored cruiser Boston. It was moored in the Honolulu harbor. And he sends out to this ship for help. And this ship sends 162 sailors and Marines and just gives them a simple order of standing by. This is a photograph of the contingent of Marines from the USS Boston. This is a traditional naval thing. Large capital ships and large naval vessels, doesn't have to be a capital ship, but large naval vessels usually carry some kind of a detachment of Marines. And what these Marines do is they guard the ship or they defend the ship in case of boarding, and they also form shore parties. So this is not an unusual mission for the Marines to be doing here, but again, these Marines are not shooting. Their presence is the threat of force rather than the application of force. And they are ready to support the Honolulu Rifles in such case as they are needed. Now, in the palace, and you can see the palace in that top photograph right there, you can also see the Queen's Guard outside in the white trousers and the dark blouses with the cannons. She is surrounded, and her guard is surrounded in the castle, and they really don't have any other choice but to surrender. And this takes place on the 17th of January, 1893. And the United States Marines do not get directly involved, but by virtue of their presence, the outcome is assured. So not only is the Queen facing the Honolulu Rifles, but she's also kind of looking over their shoulders, and behind them are these contingents of United States Marines. They may not be shooting, but the message is absolutely, totally clear. And this bottom photograph here shows the proclamation being read, the proclamation of surrender being read out to the Queen's Guard, and you can see they've already stacked their rifles, hung their gun belts, they've disarmed themselves. You can see they're kind of demoralized. They're not really standing as rigid and truncated as they were in that top photograph. You can see they're expressing that kind of esprit de corps you would expect from an elite military unit. They're clearly a little demoralized. And the Queen, for her sake, releases a statement, and she says, "By the grace of God, under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom, I, Queen, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom by certain persons claiming to have established a provisional government of and for this kingdom, that I yield to the superior force of the United States of America, whose minister, His Excellency John L. Stevens, has caused the United States troops to be landed at Honolulu and declared that he would support this provisional government." And the Committee of Safety does, in fact, establish a provisional government, and lo and behold, Dole is at the head of it, and there's a 4-man executive council, and Dole dismisses the Queen and all of her advisors, and the ultimate plan here is to seek U.S. annexation. The problem with this plan is the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland. And before his term expired, he sends a official reporter to Hawaii to just see exactly what had happened. Cleveland was really skeptical about the annexation and whether or not this was legitimate. There were questions about the use of the Marines and what all of this meant. So he sends a guy named James Henderson Blunt to Hawaii to figure out the exact particulars of the coup. And of course, Blunt writes the truth back to Cleveland, that this is all almost an internal conspiracy, and the coup was definitely not lawful. And so Cleveland wants nothing to do with this. Blunt writes that, but for the lawless occupation, the Queen and her government would never have yielded to the provisional government. So the United States, Grover Cleveland, demands that the committee and Dole reinstate the Queen and back away from this whole idea of the provisional government. Now, understandably, this really pisses off Sanford Dole. And basically, Sanford Dole tells Grover Cleveland to go to hell. And he says that the United States has no authority anyway because they've taken control and they are now, they have established this government. And Dole proclaims the Republic of Hawaii, and of course Dole ends up being president of the Republic of Hawaii. Now, the establishment of the Republic of Hawaii immediately sparks 3 days of armed rebellion. And what you have are royalists that are absolutely loyal to the Queen trying to reinstate her, and there's 3 major battles in this rebellion. And the battles are fought at a place called Diamond Head, Mo'iliili, and Manoi. And all 3 battles are total failures. The Queen is captured and imprisoned, and on January 24th, she formally abdicates the throne. And she was given a choice to either abdicate the throne or they would execute everyone who had participated in the rebellion. And the Queen here, you see on the left, is the last Hawaiian monarch. And the photograph on the right was taken from the roof of Lolani Palace. It's one of the only photographs known actually taken in this 3-day period where they were fighting the rebellion for the Queen. The beauty of the American government, of course, is that we do have peaceful political change, and the president changes in the United States in 1897. And so this attempt at annexation comes back into play. And there's about 20,000 native Hawaiians that sign a petition demanding that the United States say no to annexation, but this doesn't really slow down William McKinley. McKinley passes what's called the New Lands Resolution on the 4th of July, 1898, and Hawaii is annexed against the express wishes of at least 20,000 native Hawaiians. And your significance here is this is not only a sovereign monarchy here, this is a completely stable and functional government and an example of outright conquest, but this is not conquest in the kind of violent military sense, but it is still an imperial takeover. Hawaii is officially transferred to the United States government on the 12th of August, 1898, and surprise, surprise, Dole becomes the first territorial governor. And Hawaii, you can see in this photograph, that's the flag of the Hawaiian Republic. It is coming down for the very last time, and the U.S. flag will go up instead. And there are plenty of people that are still upset about this to this very day. Routinely, there are protests and heritage parades and things like that in Hawaii where natives, or the descendants of the natives at this time, demand for the reinstatement of the Hawaiian kingdom. And that may have been a possibility at some point shortly after 1898, but with the social importance, emotional importance, I should say, of things like Pearl Harbor and World War II, Hawaii becomes much more embedded in the American idea of the Union. And the Hawaiian annexation is pretty much smack in the middle of the Spanish-American War. And one historian, and I just love this way of thinking about it, she called the Spanish-American War a 4-month orgy of imperialism. And we need to consider the Spanish-American War. She was trying to make a point when she said that, but there's a little bit more to the Spanish-American War than just this outright, very crass kind of jump in imperialism on the part of the United States. And we've discussed before about how complicated ending wars are with Reconstruction, and this is absolutely true at the beginning of wars as well. There's many different reasons that wars get started, and there's usually no very clear-cut cause. And the Spanish-American War is an excellent example of this. And you've got multiple things going on at once. You've got an ongoing Cuban Revolution. There's plenty of guys that are trying to overthrow Spanish domination and make Cuba a free republic. There's the sinking of the battleship Maine in Cuba, and you can see the Maine here as part of the white paint scheme that we discussed earlier. This is before the explosion, of course. There's multiple failures of diplomacy. There's several very negative incidences of letters going back and forth that damaged diplomacy between Spain, the United States, and Cuba. There's the idea, this whole idea of the closing of the frontier, and that Americans are beginning to look outward for places to express their own adventurous spirit, their need to expand, to fill this gap that's left in the psyche by the closing of the frontier. And there's also kind of an adventurous idea that goes along with, well, everyone else is doing it, why shouldn't we? Every major power has got these overseas possessions. They're involved in these small colonial fights. Great Britain has got an empire that stretches across the entire planet. Germany has colonies. France has colonies. And part of the way that you demonstrate that you are a powerful nation is with these overseas colonies. So there's many different reasons why the United States gets involved in the Spanish-American War. One of the great contributors to the U.S. involvement, eventually spilling over into the Spanish-American War, is the U.S. is kind of looking south and seeing this Cuban Revolution grinding on and on and on. And you've got Cuban patriots, men like Jose Marti. They are speaking eloquently in appeal of Cuban independence. They're slowly but surely building public opinion against Spain in the United States, the idea that Spain is holding this territory so close to the United States, and also the image of these people as being oppressed by Spain. This appeals to the United States. The United States has a kind of traditional habit of looking at former colonial possessions as kind of ideologically similar to the United States. We put a lot of stock as Americans in this idea of us originally throwing off our own imperial masters and becoming a free republic, and so we kind of have a romantic view of people that are attempting to do the same thing, and you can see this playing out right here with the Cuban War of Independence. These men fighting this struggle to get rid of Spain, and America kind of saying, well, we understand that, and we support you. If not economically and military, our heart goes out to you, and we understand what you're attempting to do. So U.S. attention to these Cuban revolutionaries was having a tremendous effect at this time period. And there is something to be said about the sinking of the Maine. So this ship goes down on the 15th of February, 1898, and it's like a punctuation mark. The sinking of this ship captures public opinion. And there's never-ending debate about the explosion itself, the explosion and the sinking. Was it an accident? Was this intentional? That all of those, that's totally irrelevant, whether or not it was an accident or whether it was intentional. What's important is that the United States' reaction to this was very, very real. And in rapid succession, what you see is public opinion in the United States ramp up to a fever pitch, and very quickly the United States declares war on Spain. And the declaration of war comes on the 25th of April, 1898. Now, in terms of combat deaths, the Spanish-American War is relatively small. You've got something right around 500 KIAs for the entire war. Many, many more soldiers die from diseases than bullets, but you shouldn't look at the Spanish-American War solely in terms of combat deaths or the scale of military action. The bulk of land combat takes place on Cuba, the island of Cuba, and the United States is able to make use of certain new pieces of equipment. And you'll find, as we talk about American history, that developments in technology often have a correlation with military weaponry. So we talked about the conquest of the West and the domination of the environment in the West, and how these high-powered rifles that were suddenly available post-Civil War played a huge role in the destruction of the buffalo. You have a substantial increase in technology right here at the time of the Spanish-American War in the terms of what's called, they have a brand new battle rifle. It's called the Krag-Jorgensen rifle. It's a carbine, which means it's shorter, it's easier to carry, it's incredibly reliable, it's very accurate. It's a bolt-action rifle that fires a cartridge, and the cartridges are reliable. They can be carried in, they can get wet instead of just falling apart like cartridges previously. And it's fed from an internal box magazine. And for those of you that don't know anything about guns, what that means is you can load 5 rounds into that rifle and fire 5 times before you have to reload. Compare that to the single shot that you saw in the video, or we talked about these guys that are shooting buffaloes. So you've got a dramatic increase not only in the reliability and the ability to produce this weapon, but also in the amount of lead that you can project at the enemy. So it's a great improvement. The military is able to project this force, and they use this to tremendous effect when they're fighting on the ground in Cuba. And within weeks, the United States ground forces just basically chop up and grind up the Spanish forces down to nothing. This is all over Cuba. And by the 16th of July, 1898, Cuba falls. A treaty officially ending the war is signed in December, but you could see how fast this entire thing, mobilization, deployment, everything takes place. In this photograph, you can see these soldiers celebrating victory right at their trench line, somewhere outside of Havana. One very important figure to mention that's involved in this is a guy by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt is a firm believer in this idea that the frontier is closed, and Americans need places and opportunities to test themselves, because that's what makes people great and strong, is this kind of perpetual motion of testing oneself in conflict. And so war is, of course, the ultimate test, and the idea of conquest is the ultimate expression of this. And Roosevelt also believes in this kind of civilizing mission of the United States, carrying the ideas, the ideals, the American ideals of republic and unity and liberty, even if it means using violence in the military to do this. And his interaction, or his presence in this war, establishes him as a fixture in people's public opinion. Love or hate, it makes him a household name that people talk about. And you can see these kind of very romantic photographs that are produced. You can see the kind of very early ideas of political imagery going on here. That photograph on the left is sending a very clear message about masculinity and power and force. Now, this kind of imagery is going to be very beneficial to Theodore Roosevelt in later years. We'll talk about that when we get there. But this is somebody you're going to need to know a lot about. There is a significant amount of black troops deployed to fight in Cuba. Now, this is not an instance of equity in service. The United States government has this idea based upon the kind of quasi-scientific beliefs at the time that blacks had a natural immunity to tropical disease, or were more resistant to tropical disease, and could handle heat and humidity and hardships better than regular troops. This is, of course, total ridiculous nonsense, but it's still an important part of the story. There's a great irony here as well, in that you have these black men coming from places in the West in the United States, and they're fighting for the freedom of Cuba, only to be returning home to the kind of early era of Jim Crow, this system of legislated inequality in the United States that we talked about at the end of the Reconstruction lecture. There were Spanish prisoners of war that reported being absolutely stunned to see the level of the fighting spirit of these black units. And lots of the black infantry that was interviewed or wrote letters, they were surprised to find themselves in a situation where they were fighting mulattoes and blacks in the Spanish forces. But this willingness to use troops, you'll see again and again and again, and these infantry units and cavalry units are beginning to make a name for themselves. While the Spanish forces are imploding on Cuba, on the other side of the world, the United States Navy attacks Spanish possessions. I'm speaking in the Philippines. And there's the Battle of Manila Bay. This takes place the 1st of May, 1898, and it results in the complete and total destruction of the Spanish fleet. Total destruction is not a... It's a literal statement. The Spanish fleet was burned right to the waterline, and the United States Navy suffered 1 casualty, 1 killed in action, and he was an overweight sailor who died of heat stroke on the gun deck. So he wasn't even killed by return fire. These powerful naval vessels that the United States had been building all this time were put into battle and just literally mowed down the Spanish fleet. almost like shooting ducks in a barrel. The fight was over so fast that even the Navy was surprised at how quickly and efficiently the Spanish fleet had been destroyed. The success of this battle and the conquest in the Philippines, the defeat of the Spanish in the Philippines, is so complete that the United States Navy didn't have enough sailors and troops on the ships to actually hold the islands. So they actually have to request more troops be rushed to the Philippines because they don't have enough Marines to garrison and occupy the places that they've just conquered. This is how fast this war is happening, how fast these things are, how quickly that the American Empire is spreading overseas. Now, even though you see a very quick resolution and surrender of the Spanish, and you see that peace treaty in December, the issues generated from the Spanish-American conflict are unresolved. And part of the idea that the Filipinos had when the Americans came in was that they would be granted a republic of their own. The United States might help them set it up, but there wasn't going to be any kind of domination in a colonial sense, and they were gravely mistaken. And on the 3rd of January 1899, the Philippines decides it wants to be an independent republic with no U.S. domination. And after that declaration begins several years of increasingly nasty warfare between the United States and a fledgling Filipino government that is desperately trying to survive. In this photograph, you can see the basic Filipino soldier. He is very lightly armed, very lightly clothed, but what he has going for him is an immense knowledge of the terrain and a lot of experience in asymmetrical warfare, guerrilla-style warfare. There's been a resistance in the Philippines against Spanish domination for a long time as well, and these guys have been fighting this kind of conflict in fits and spurts on and off for a long, long time. So transferring that kind of aggressive stance to the United States is kind of a natural feature. And it happens very quickly when the United States puts domination over the Philippines. Now contrast that with your U.S. soldier. The U.S. has by far superior technology. They've got superior access to military material, and they've got superior training in traditional military tactics. And this serves the United States military quite well, especially in the early parts of the war. And I just realized that on that last slide that I called the Philippine, the official name is the Philippine Insurrection, and I just called it a war. And I would put to you that men that are fighting each other would make very little of this distinction between insurrection and war. When you've got people trying to kill each other, it's war. But that's neither here nor there. The fighting that's going on here is fundamentally different. Jungle warfare, as you would see in the Philippines, takes all manner of unique demands on the soldier. And you can see what's going on here, having to slog through swamps and keep your gear dry, maintain your weapons. This kind of environment also creates problems in terms of bringing this modern military technology to bear. Great, you've got heavy weapons, wonderful. Does this look like a kind of place where they can be successfully used in combat? And the United States Army at this time is a product, an absolutely wonderful product of the industrialization process that we talked about in that last lecture. You've got these military products, machine guns, artillery, mass-produced machine parts, interchangeable components, and rifles that make this such a powerful force. But the United States Army has difficulty applying this technology because of the environment that they find themselves in. And again, you end up with many black troops being transferred and sent into this similar kind of environment, sent to the tropics for reasons that we've already discussed. And the spirit and skill of these units really begins to make they really begin to make names for themselves, and people begin to remember the 10th U.S. Cavalry and their deeds and how hard they fight, and it begins to establish a reputation in the military itself for their quality as soldiers. So initially, the combat scene in the Philippines goes very well for the United States. Pitched battles do not go well for the Filipinos. They're not equipped to tactically confront the United States, and they don't have the kind of firepower that the U.S. Army can project. The fighting eventually kind of turns into very small unit actions, and that's a response of not being able to stand in these pitched battles. Now, the Filipino president, Emilio Aguinaldo, is advised by some of his generals that what he needs to do is stop trying to just outright confront the United States toe-to-toe in a pitched battle, and they advise him not to try to defeat, just outright destroy the United States Army, but to continue to inflict constant losses on them. And the idea behind that is you've got a presidential election going on in the United States at this time. You got two guys competing against each other. One is William Jennings Bryan, and Bryan is a pacifist. He absolutely hates the idea of imperialism. He's a staunch anti-imperialist. And from what you already know about McKinley's involvement in Hawaii, you don't need to be told how he feels about imperialism. So the government of the Philippines knows that if they can cause enough damage to the United States Army and make it bad enough in the papers and look bad enough at home, on the home front, maybe Bryan, who's got no use for imperialism, will become president, and he'll make a peace treaty, or he'll just pull the army out of the Philippines entirely. Conversely, if McKinley wins, they know that the United States isn't going anywhere. And McKinley wins that election, and because the Filipino resistance cannot confront the army in a pitched battle, they resort to guerrilla warfare. And the most feared general on the Filipino side is this man on the left here, Miguel Malvar, and he's an absolute master of guerrilla warfare. And they begin ambushes, lightning attacks, doing things to prisoners of war, mutilating dead bodies, setting booby traps, attacking behind lines, things like that, guerrilla-style tactics. And the United States Army's response is to send much more aggressive soldiers into this situation, men like James Franklin Bell. And Bell hunts down the guerrillas mercilessly, with special attention paid to Malvar himself. And think about the nature of this combat, too. It's extremely tough to put down rebellion on the part of the common soldier. So look at your photograph here, and look at your soldier. How can you, if the guerrilla, the soldier, is hiding in the population, how can you tell who is the enemy? And if you can't tell who is the enemy, how do you defeat that enemy? How do you find and destroy an enemy that is both everywhere and nowhere all at the same time? And this puts the U.S. soldier in an impossible position because they're being asked to use lethal violence, but there's trouble in determining exactly where do you apply it. So it makes it extremely tough on the soldier down at the individual level. And all of this as the fighting is getting more chaotic and much more brutal because we're going to a smaller scale guerrilla warfare, which is much more savage in nature. And again, guerrilla warfare is extremely brutal, and death becomes, the atrocities and death is emphasized by both sides. You see in this photograph here, the Filipinos are shot and dumped in a ditch. And these kind of images are used to demonstrate to anyone on the outside just how brutal one side is over the other. So you can also find photographs of American soldiers who were captured or mutilated as a prisoner of war and then left to be discovered. And civilians also get sucked into this whole mess. And as this continues to drag on, the tactics and the actions that both sides resort to get more and more brutal. And in this particular conflict, there's a unique and new technique that is used. It's called the water cure. And what you have here is exactly as illustrated in this photograph. You've got some guys who hold another guy down, and they'll pour water into his face and down his throat until it's a form of extracting information. You are willing to tell them anything they want to know because it feels like you're drowning. And we have modern corollaries to this, obviously. And I'm not using this photograph as, again, let me be very clear about this. I'm not using this photograph as a way of saying that the United States Army is bad and they've done horrible things. I'm using this as a demonstration of the scale of violence that has been generated by the nature of this conflict and how completely nasty this entire fight has become. Incidentally, if you look on the left-hand side where the red arrow is pointing, this soldier is leaning on a stack of Krag Jorgensen carbines that are probably the small arms of those guys that are interrogating the native in the center. And given enough time and given enough violence, brutality is a solution. Destroying your enemy is a way of ending the war. And if you continue these tactics long enough and the brutality gets worse and worse and worse, you will eventually grind your enemy, if you have the will, into surrender. And that's what this photograph shows right here. That's actually Malvar right there surrendering with the last of his 70 troops. And everybody in that photograph has been chased all over the place and they're starving, but they're surrendering to the United States Army. And this is in 1902. And the fighting in the Philippine insurrection may be over, but the newspapers have said the war is over. Everyone congratulates themselves, but fighting continues on without any stopping. And there's a series of small rebellions that go right past 1902, and they're in places like Leyte and in the mountainous regions on the center islands in the Philippines. And what the United States does is it uses the Filipino government to put down these rebellions, these internal rebellions, almost like a police action, so that they don't have to declare an insurrection and deploy massive amounts of U.S. troops, but they're still continued fighting right on past 1902. Now, where the United States does end up heavily involved is in the extreme south of the Philippines is an island called Jolo, and it is the site of what's called the Moro Rebellion. And the fighting and the Moro Rebellion is extremely savage. It is the Moro culture values certain types of fighting. Fearlessness in combat is a virtue. It's wrapped up with masculinity, and they also tend to fight instead of with heavy weapons like the United States Army does, more hand-to-hand with knives and clubs and spears and things like that. So the Moros are especially frustrated and angry with the Philippines because the Philippines, owing to the Spanish heritage of the original Spanish conquest, is Catholic and Roman Catholic. And the Moros are Muslims. And the extreme southern parts of the Philippines have this Muslim population. And there's great friction between the Catholic majority in the north and the Muslim minority in the south. And the United States ends up getting involved and putting down this Moro rebellion. This photograph is fairly emblematic of the Moro campaign, and you can see it's just mounds of bodies. There's a kind of take no prisoner aspect to this, But you also have to remember that the men that have been involved with this, think of the type of combat they've been exposed to and the lessons that they've taken from that combat and applied to their own unique situation as they continue to fight this fight that just drags on and on and on. So imagine, what you see here, pits full of the enemy dead and the U.S. troops posing with them. The final battle with the Moro takes place between the 11th and 15th of June 1913, and the final holdouts have established themselves on a mountaintop, and they are killed to a man. They literally fight to the death, and you can see a photograph on the left there of a typical Moro warrior. He's got kind of handmade, or homemade, if you will, armor with little metal plates that have been beaten out roughly, and a great big knife, and part of their culture is this warrior mystique and fearlessness in battle. And the leader on the United States side in this battle was a man named Blackjack Pershing. And he gets the name Blackjack because he's one of the officers that was originally assigned to one of these large sections of black infantry and led them in combat in the Philippines. And Pershing goes on to fight to great acclaim in Mexico, and then later in World War I. He's another figure that you're going to see crop up again. And he's a person who sees combat and has these experiences, and they influence his reactions and the way he applies himself and his troops later in time. So the ultimate questions that we're confronted with is the impressive nature with this expansion, the sudden imperial expansion, but is this a nefarious thing on the part of the United States? Is this a malicious attempt to invade the world and set up these empires and engage in these kind of horrors of colonialism? And this is a subject of a lot of debate. And this is also a good place to think about what's called presentism. And I've talked about this before, this tendency we have to take the baggage of our own society, our own beliefs, and our own feelings about the way culture and the United States should work and read it back on the past. And in a modern sense, everything that we've talked about, or I've talked about in the last 52 minutes, is mortifying. All of the things that took place in the Philippine putting down that resurrection and the destruction of the Moro rebellion is it's horrifying. It's not the kind of thing you would picture the United States or the United States military doing. But we can't read our perceptions back on those people in that time doing that job. They come and they have an entirely different concept of structure in society and how people should relate to themselves, and an entirely different view of the United States in terms of a civilizing force. And if you look at this cartoon, the eagle has the sun coming up behind it. It's this impressive figure, and that's kind of what they're saying is that now this empire is stretching from one end of the globe to the other, and it's got this beautiful light of union and liberty that's coming along with it. But you've also got the idea that you've got an empire by default. In the same way, this is also a great cartoon, and it's kind of asking you to think about the balance of these realities of imperialism, and how do you balance it with the idealistic motivations for colonization versus what are literally very true horrors of colonialism. And there are absolutely real benefits as shown here: economic prosperity, voting rights, education, sanitation. But there's also ideas about national sovereignty and being able to have agency over one's own nation. And these are certainly valuable questions But there's a certain line that, as the historian, you have to consider is what is a philosophical issue and what is a concern for the historian. And the moral questions about imperialism and the nature of colonialism and things like that, those are more philosophical questions best left to philosophers, and historians can study the nuts and bolts and the actual when and how of these things taking place.